Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel on governance today at Upstream. Really excited to bring a great panel to you today. A bunch of folks from across the range of open source organizations, different perspectives on open source and free software, and how we all work together. What's the glue that binds us? Because it's not just the code, it's also how we as human beings work together, which is, of course, one of our themes here today at Upstream. I'm going to start with Stephen O'Grady of Red Monk, somebody who's been around this space for a very long time and advises a lot of clients on how to interact with and produce open source. And Stephen, for those of you who don't follow him on Twitter, is somewhat famous for being, at this point, a little cranky about ever talking about licensing. And at one point, as we were putting this panel together, it was the licensing panel. And I spoke up and said, no. I think we should broaden it. We should think about governance. Then in our emails, it became the licensing panel again. And I'm going to ask Stephen to start with, why is licensing such a sore topic? Why are you almost famously sick of licensing at this point?
So I think the short answer to that question is because we seem to end up having the same conversation over and over and over. And, when you present it that way, there are people who want licensing to change, to adapt to new conditions, which in my opinion is completely appropriate. But, the sort of flip side to that is that, the sort of impetus, for many of the would-be sort of license changers, if you will, is urgent in their minds, and they want change now. They want change yesterday, and they don't tend to care about the collateral damage that sort of may inflict on other communities. And more principally, they don't necessarily understand or care to appreciate the fact that open source has been successful, in my view, at least in part because it has been stable, right? We've had an approach, we've had a set of approaches over time, and enterprises, sort of the downstream consumers, therefore, know what it means, right? So many of us go back to the early days when there's all kinds of crazy open source licenses. And that means that everybody adopting a project or wanting to adopt a sort of given project is, essentially forced to do a one-off license review, where instead today we have sets of classes of licenses which bring with them very different roles and responsibilities that are broadly understood by would-be users. So that's a system that has worked. That's a system that is imperfect for sure, but it's a system that has delivered really outsized results, I think, to developers, to enterprises, to a whole community of open source software. And, when I get cranky about it, it tends to be around people who would come in and, sort of not respect, or frankly, in many cases, just pay attention to all of the work that has preceded them and just want change now, and are uncaring of what the implications that those changes might be. So, yeah, I get a little cranky from time to time.
I think maybe one of the most interesting things that I hear in that is that open source has its tendrils everywhere now, right? And so for better or for worse, that makes change hard sometimes, right? And you have to have some discussions one way or the other. You have to have them over and over again. I really want to come back to that point, but let me introduce our next panelist today, Pam Chester. Pam is an attorney, is a member of the Open Source Initiative Board, has previously worked at Red Hat, currently runs her own shop, Chester Legal, which is a trademark attorney to the stars of the open source movement. Everybody who's anyone uses Pam to manage their trademarks, and really one of the deepest thinkers about how communities and their brands work together. Because I think, Pam, I think it's safe to say that for a long time, open source communities did not think in a very sophisticated way about their trademarks and their brands, and you've been almost single-handedly on a mission to change that and make it more mature, and of course we're all benefiting from that. You're also, as I am, an attorney. This is the second panel I've been on the past few weeks where the organizers tried hard to find maintainers interested in licensing. ended up with a panel mostly composed of lawyers and OSI board members. What do you think that tells us about the state of licensing? I mean, should we be listening less to the lawyers and more to the developers, or is there maybe a healthy tension there? You're muted, Pam. Sorry. The great curse of 2020 and 2021.
Yeah, I could have had all that great introduction time to unmute myself, but I didn't think to. So there's a couple different things going on in the conversation. So one is, I don't think that most human beings are interested at all in legal instruments, and they want nothing to do with them. So I don't find it surprising or shocking that developers don't care about the ins and outs or the details of those legal documents the way that we do. So that doesn't surprise me. I mean, I was just right before this conference call, this panel, I was working on a license that, I have on a proprietary license, and I have no doubt that my client had not read it yet. Like they don't want to read it. They don't want to know it has to say what it says. So I don't know that that has actually changed over time. What I do think has changed, and I kind of share the fatigue over these sort of we get these, what I would think of as sort of new movements on something about changing open source licensing or what's wrong with open source licensing. I think that I have seen the attempt to discriminate based on the user on commercial conditions. I've seen that come around. I think this is the third time around that I've seen it come in during my tenure, during my time that I've been an open source lawyer. So I think that does come around every so often, and I share the sort of fatigue over it, that here we go again. And those who propound it or sort of think that they have this brilliant new solution when it hasn't worked in 20 years. What I do find new and different this time around, or what we're seeing more recently, is efforts to use licenses for, I'll just say grossly as a category, sort of ethical missions. And this I find interesting, and I will say, and thank you, I will say that I'm not speaking on behalf of OSI here. These are my personal opinions, but they kind of, cross over. I think, it becomes a challenge for license review at OSI, sort of because what's happening is these conditions, these parameters, they're trying to solve a different problem, but using a copyright license to do that is challenging. And is it appropriate, and when is it right to do that? So these are questions that we have to face at OSI. So that's what I'm seeing as different right now is, and maybe it's not different, I do know it has come up before, is these efforts to sort of leverage that copyright license to do something that really has nothing to do with the copyright itself, which is what the license is for, that granted that license for the copyright and or patent rights adjacent to it. So that I find really interesting, although and others can correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm also seeing is that there is some understanding, there seems to be some shift, that now people are seeing that there may be other tools for being those societal changers that we want to be, through maybe uses of codes of conduct or something like that. So that, yeah, so I guess to summarize, nobody wants to read a license. This sort of commercial open source is nothing new, been there, done that. But the area of sort of ethical licenses and societal change through licenses, I think, is interesting. And there are people who are working there, and I do find that work sort of interesting to watch.
Right. Actually, I think that's a great segue to our last speaker, Amy Perrin, who one is still muted, and and two is it is not too late for Amy to save herself from the bar. She has completed law school, but is not yet technically a lawyer. It's not too late. You could still flee and avoid a life of the law. and besides being managed to simultaneously get through law school while working for the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, CNCF, and has also worked for Linux Foundation. And so, I think an interesting thread that both Stephen and Pam mentioned is this notion of standardization, right? That there was a lot of benefit for open source, that there was essentially, you could really say, a couple of classes of licenses and no more than 10 licenses. Like, you can cover the vast majority of open source with the overwhelming majority with like 7 or 8 licenses. And whereas foundation models is much more diverse, right? Linux Foundation covers a wide range of projects, from things we've all heard of, like the Linux kernel, to Kubernetes, to I believe at one point, I don't know if this is still the case, Linux Foundation had not one but 2 different drone software foundations. And and of course, numerically, the vast majority of software projects aren't governed by a foundation at all. And so how do you, I think there's a really interesting contrast, right? There's this broad diversity of foundations, narrow choice of licenses. Does that tell us anything interesting? Is there anything that folks should know about that?
Maybe. And I kind of want to pick up where Pam left off, as far as like the licensing is one particular tool, but we're now seeing a place where like governance is something that can come in and kind of like affect change, and to be able to say like what happens in a project and why. Governance is kind of like the expansion out in from like licensing is just directly copyright and directly around like what intellectual property is. Well, that gets awfully confusing when you're coming towards like an open source landscape. And trying to be able to actually make that understandable. Governance is where we write down like who gets power in a project, why, what say they have, and what happens when there's a conflict. And that's so much more understandable, as far as like, I think one of your themes today is how we work with each other. And that's where I think there's a little bit more flexibility, power, and kind of reflects the larger sense of diversity between all of our projects. And you did mention like the Linux kernel, an older, much kind of more direct model of like one single person will know all of these things and be responsible for it. And then we've evolved into these other places where like Kubernetes has a steering committee and no one direct person can know everything about Kubernetes. And then we've got also like tiny little sandbox projects over in CNCF. Like there's sometimes 2 or 3 people just working on something that looks interesting and compelling, and other people want to be able to come and contribute. And you figure out how that works with governance.
Right. Well, and there's certainly, I mean, you mentioned some of these small projects, and there are many. I think one of the perhaps underappreciated, especially for folks coming into open source as sort of from a more consumer perspective, right? And I don't mean that in a bad way. You often are familiar with certain brands, right? Like Kubernetes or one of the big JavaScript frameworks, but there's sort of this vague sense of, oh, and there's hundreds of dependencies. But knowing what's going on in those dependencies, is certainly
turning into a big issue. Yes.
Right. yeah, and that's just I think that I mean, as you said, right, these are about human power in part because we've limited the way we use legal tools that traditional corporations use, right, like license terms. We've limited those in scope and said you give away most of the power, so the power then accrues in other ways. I think it's safe to say maybe the foundations are one of the ways we channel that power, right?
I'd say that's fair.
Yeah. Stephen, what do you tell your clients? I mean, you obviously advise a lot of folks who produce a lot of open source, but also everyone consumes a lot of open source at this point. What do you tell them? Like, are foundations a mark of, like, a guaranteed mark of good governance in your book? Is it more nuanced?
I think the net is that I think when we look at it, all of these things, licenses, trademarks, foundations, governance, right, are tools to solve specific problems, right? So in other words, The vast majority of open source projects, in fact, carry no license. And they carry no license because it's some developer who wrote a script for themselves and threw it on GitHub. They don't have any intention necessarily for anybody else to use it. It's just a place to store it, right? And likewise with governance, what it comes down to for us is usually two things, right? Which is one, it's much more important than people tend to realize, and two, you really need to think out sort of what the goals are, right? So as an example, one of the things we've seen sort of repeatedly are, producers of open source software, commercial organizations have an asset and they say, I want this sort of asset to be open source for a variety of reasons, right? In some cases, it's sort of, cynical PR play, but in a lot of cases, it's genuinely, all right, I want this sort of asset to be available to customers because that's what they want, or developers, want to get under, the hood and kick the tires and so on. And so they go through the sort of act of open sourcing this, right? They select the license, they select, some place to host this code. In some cases, there's all sorts of, press and launch materials. And then people show up and want to make changes. And it's like, okay, what happens now? Right. And as it turns out, in several cases, they just haven't necessarily thought about the governance, in which case this tends to paradoxically make people really unhappy. Because, on the one hand, the people who wrote the software initially think they're doing a good thing and saying to a community, here's this asset, you can look at this now, it's, sources available to you and so on, and they expect to get sort of, kudos for that. And instead they get blowback, right? Because people can't use it or can't contribute back and so on. So, to us, governance usually comes down to, what are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? Do you want other companies to work on this? Do you want to work on it yourself? Is this really just a source available model? So like I said, all these things for me, licenses is, maybe the best example, because you have licenses that are designed to accomplish very different things. And you have communities that are passionately committed to, typically one of those things, where, we have the luxury as analysts, like we don't take a viewpoint other than this system as a whole, needs to be supported and defended. So which license or which governance, sort of model you select really depends on sort of your outcome, what you're trying to achieve, which, which brings us to foundations. And foundations, again, are just a tool. They are entirely appropriate in some circumstances. If you have, large scale projects, which are going to have not only sort of multiple large competitors often collaborating on the same project, but also significant legal, PR, marketing, et cetera, needs, foundations are a very appropriate mechanism for addressing several of those issues. Does every software project need a foundation? Not remotely, right? If a project doesn't need a license, it certainly doesn't need a foundation. So I think the difficulty for a lot of things is that, people want to say there's one way to do this, there's one approach, there's one sort of mechanism. And, from our perspective, you have such a sort of multitude of needs and drivers and incentives, both on the sort of downstream consumption side, as well as the upstream authorship side, that, you really have to sit down and think about, what are we trying to accomplish here, right? What's the goal? And that will determine, whether, what license you need, you want to select, what your governance model is a foundation appropriate or not? It really is it's a complicated set of evaluations. And to be fair, I think the industry has gotten better at this over time. There's an understanding now where there wasn't, say, 5 or 10 years ago, that you can't just take an open source project, chuck it over the wall and expect it to succeed, right? That was very much a model that a couple of the large internet companies, for example, pursued for some time. And we don't see as much of that anymore.
There's a lot of educational institutions as well, to be fair. There was definitely a period where everyone, we just slapped the magic license on it. And
yeah, it's got a license. It's great. Of course, this is going to succeed now. So yeah, I think from our perspective, I guess, like I said, the simplest way to sum it up is all of these things, license, trademark, foundation, governance, et cetera, they're tools. And tools there's times when you need a hammer, there's times when you need a saw, there's times when you need a screwdriver. It really depends on what you're trying to do.
I really appreciate your nuance between like the source available part and the projects that want to be part of a community as well, because that's actually a really critical piece as well, as far as like what choices you would make and then what both success and failure would look like. And I think we're starting to get to a place that is a lot more nuanced than has been available in the past.
Yeah, although, one of the things we say at Redmonk all the time is that the market's ability to appreciate nuance is not particularly good. Which is why you end up having, these sort of periodic blow-ups over what is essentially a question of nuance, right? But I think we're getting to a point where people are they realize they have to put some thought into it. Just the fact that like open source program offices, they didn't exist, right, 10 years ago. I can't remember the exact time frame, but they were certainly rare, and those are more and more common. So organizations they're adapting. They understand that, hey, we need to think through. It's not just, do we make the actual, lines of code available? There's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, that's so much more true to it. Pam, I can't help but think about these Stephen's assessment that this is a tool. I can't help but think that sometimes you come in at the point where people find that they need a tool, right? That they like have a brand that's well recognized, and now they're starting to think about, oh, what's that mean, right? Because certainly for a lot of organic community growth, sometimes that there's that exponential takeoff of recognition that sometimes projects have, right? Is there any are there any key pieces of advice that you wish you could tell your clients if they didn't, if they brought you in on day one? What are the kinds of things that you would love to tell them?
Yeah, this is such an intersection of sort of my my trademark work and what everybody's been talking about, because I have always said that look for the governance and you'll find out who owns the trademark, because that's where kind of the rubber hits the road, is when you get into disagreements. Is you have some people start a project and then it becomes successful, and then they're not sure who owns that asset, and so that's what I think of the trademark. I can sometimes use the trademark as a tool to sort of reverse engineer what is the governance here, to sort of how are you organized, how do you make decisions. So just to sort of backfill a little bit on that, so a trademark is owned by the entity that controls the mark and controls the quality of the goods and services with it. So I may go to a project and say, okay, how are you making decisions about what gets added to the software code base? Who's making those decisions? Is there an organization? How, what kind of how many people are involved? What are their various positions and relationships to each other? And it may be, I say all the time, I point out all the time that Linus Torvalds owns the trademark for Linux. It's in his name personally. So, that's consistent with what we know about how the Linux kernel is created and maintained. So to me, it's kind of a, it's kind of a window. I can use a trademark into a window, or if I talk about it, the trademark, then all of a sudden people grasp it because trademarks are so part of our human experience that everybody understands them and everybody understands what they are. And so you can kind of like do some thinking by using the trademark as the mechanism to get people to talk about their organization. And again, I backdoor that into them figuring out for themselves what their governance is. An organization may not realize it, but when you start talking to them, then they'll be able to uncover it. And I would like to think that someone could use that as an opportunity to capture and memorialize what their governance is. So if you have these organizations or small groups that really sort of are, don't have documented or haven't really thought about it, this might be an opportunity for them to sort of take that next step in their development to memorialize what is going on with their organization, which I think would be a positive benefit for them. So it's a really
follow along.
Yeah.
Do you ever ask the question about like how people get added and taken away from governance as part of this conversation?
I well, so if there is an organization that is so well organized that it has people come and go from it, then probably conceptually it's that organization itself would be the trademark owner in that sense. So in other words, we do have this concept of an artificial person, or an entity as a legal person, and that can own the trademark, even when that organization doesn't have a governmental, it hasn't gone to the government for, hasn't filed isn't a corporation or filed as a nonprofit or something like that. We do allow these, the law does have these concepts of groups that are organized to work together, and recognizes those groups as a legal entity, whether or not they themselves recognize it, the law recognizes it. So in that case, but frankly, when I first started doing this work, it was that concept of people coming and going that just petrified me because I was just like, oh my God, what is going on? Like, who are all these people? And they come and go, and then they're sending emails to tell people to stop doing stuff. And I was just like, so it is a great question, but I think I conceptualize it as there is this sort of, there is an organization that is one layer above the individuals themselves. There is a collective, and that collective has legal existence. So that's the solution I've come to. I don't know whether the other lawyers might think differently about it, but that's the resolution I've reached.
A paper that I often tell people to read is it's called the Tyranny of Structurelessness. It's by Joe Freeman, I believe is the name of the author. And it's an article about like 1960s and 1970s, like anarcho-feminist collectives. And and it's basically like, well, yeah, we all said in these collectives that there was no governance, there was no leadership, there was no structure. But of course there was. Right. Yeah. And so the whole paper is sort of an unpeeling of like, well, we said there's no structure, but actually there was structure. It just wasn't written down. It wasn't documented. And your notion of using trademark as like almost like a magnifying glass to help us unpeel, because, I said, I think I may have misspoken earlier. I might have said something along the lines of like, well, most projects don't have governance. In fact, every project has governance. It's just a question of how realized it is. The governance may just be, well, whatever defaults GitHub sets for pull requests. But like that is a form of governance. Right. What are the defaults for moderation in GitHub issue discussions or GitLab issue discussions? Like those are a form of governance, even if they're not in a legal document filed with the state of Delaware, right? And I think Pam
kind of matter. Yeah.
What's that?
Sorry, who has commit rights matters.
Yes.
And then how it gets taken away, which is why I was asking Pam about like, how does this like work structurally? It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Oh, it's super fascinating, right? And underappreciated. And boy, Stephen, what you said about markets not doing nuance, that like, because I think one of the huge changes here over the past 20 years, which in some ways has been very powerful, but has really eroded a lot of norms that we once relied on, was this change from to assemble a piece of software. You went to a bunch of different websites and you like downloaded a piece of software from one site. And by the way, you found by like going to the website, you found out who was behind it. You found out a little bit about the mark, a little bit, and you did that for like 20 different things. And then you built your software on top of it. And you had and you had some sense of what was under the hood. And now it's not just that the markets has eliminated nuance, it's that the package installation infrastructure, which on the one hand has been super powerful. It allows us to say, I'm just going to install this one thing and all the dependencies are going to be automatic. And like any nuance about what's under the hood in all those dependencies out the window, right? Like you have to work really hard to know what's going on under the hood for all those, and that applies to trademark, to, as we're finding out now, there's a different panel at Upstream on supply chain, but otherwise I would love to just, that governance and supply chain overlap is going to be really critical as we start taking that more seriously, right?
Yeah, for sure. And that's, when it comes to, sort of going back to, some of the, I believe it was Pam who sort of raised the ethical licenses, right? Or take license, some of the other experimental licenses in other areas. One of the things that I think, folks haven't thought through in many cases is, with the way that software is built today, as you know, right, it's very rare that somebody comes out with, here is a complete asset in and of itself, and I have no dependencies, right? So that's just, not common. And we've all heard the stories of, things like, left pads removed from NPM and all sorts of stuff, and the node ecosystem starts to break and so on. And, so part of the, I don't know, sort of issue here is not just sort of the supply chain, right? In terms of like, okay, what am I consuming? Sort of what are the licenses and the trademarks and, sort of that apply to all this, but what do they, how do they combine, right? And in many cases, with the sort of base open source set of licenses that have been agreed on over time, we know how those work, right? We have a good understanding of, okay, these licenses can be combined, these ones cannot. And from an enterprise standpoint, I don't want to say it's a solved problem. The lawyers on the line would probably take exception with that, but it's something that, again, it doesn't devolve to, in most cases, a sort of one-by-one license contract, et cetera, review. It comes down to, all right, I have policies in terms of what I will and won't accept. And, when we begin to have, brand new licenses with unclear implications, and in many cases, these, they may be, the licenses themselves may be mutable, right? So in other words, if it depends on, for example, code of conduct, okay, that code of conduct then becomes a dependency for the license. And, all this can shift over time. So I guess my point is that, the software supply chain these days is really complicated and it's really nuanced. And, sort of any experimentation from a licensing standpoint in particular is going to make the governance side of things much more complicated, right? Because we have to consider things that, combinations that not only in many cases haven't been tried before, but are, frankly, probably not answerable, at least until courts test some of these issues. So yeah, it's a hard problem to solve for sure.
Stephen, I'm just curious. I take your point and I appreciate your point about these sort of, now I would almost characterize them as license dependencies now, as if you import a code of conduct into a license, so this sort of dependency. I kind of take the view, maybe it's a little cynical, that we aren't going to see new licenses for exactly the reason you say, is it overcomplicates things. And so do you think that sort of the market will self-correct, and even if people try to have new licenses or try to introduce new concepts, the market's going to say, no thanks, don't need it, too complicated, we'll stick with what we have? In the same sense that you mentioned, companies will have, these are our acceptable licenses, these newer efforts to change licensing are never going to make that list.
It's a great question, Pam. I think the short answer for me, and Lewis can probably guess what I'm going to say here, because this has come up for me before. I'm very skeptical of the ethical licenses, in particular for their prospects within business, right? So in other words, if you write a piece of software and you apply an ethical license to it, and you have no ambitions for that to be used within business, you just wrote it for your own use or the use of organizations that are important to you, then I think that's entirely appropriate. I've maintained all along that if you write a piece of software, you can license it however you want, right? And you can apply whatever terms you want. What it comes down to is who you want to use it and what your ambitions are. So in other words, yeah, am I skeptical that the ethical class of licenses, more particularly the ones that have mutable terms to them, are going to see widespread adoption from an enterprise standpoint? Certainly. So that is sort of not a primary concern for me. In other words, I think to your point, I think let the market decide. If the market decides that these are valuable licenses, whether it's climate change or human rights or whatever, and adopts them at scale, look, personally, I'm in favor of most of the ethical principles at stake here. It's more, I can't see the mechanism by which this works legally. I don't think the license is the appropriate tool. And anyway, that's a much longer conversation to have. But I'm in favor of all the experimentation that people want to do in the area. Where I tend to get frustrated are when people try to redefine, change, alter, disrupt the definitions of open source that have gotten us to where we are today, without sort of much care or thought or attention to, as I said before, sort of the downstream implications of that. So can we and should we have a conversation about what we want open source to be in a world that looks very different than it did 20 years ago? By all means. But should that include radical changes essentially overnight, which could essentially overturn the apple cart of, hey, we have a sort of an open source community that, as I said before, is absolutely imperfect and absolutely has things that need to be improved, but has largely worked. And open source has become the default, where it certainly wasn't a decade or two ago. So that's the part that I sort of take exception to, which is experimentation in a particular domain, ethical or otherwise, great. Go try it, see if the market adopts it. But when people try to sort of inject that into open source itself, one, I don't think it will work, and two, it's like I said, a lot of the conversations I have had in that space have been frustrating because I think people don't understand why and how open source works, at least on the business side of things, which to me is largely because over a period of years, decades, in fact, enterprise lawyers have learned, perhaps not everything, but they've largely learned, sort of what the GPL is. They've learned what the Apache license is. They've learned what the MIT license is, and so on. And, so they can look at these assets and say, okay, I approve this, I don't approve it, whatever. But I understand, roughly speaking, the basic concepts involved. And yeah, when we, like I said, you have folks that want to come in and sort of change that overnight. And I am very much not in favor of that, but also it's the way that the conversations have been conducted, which is, I've had literally, people come back and say, okay, boomer, like, just get out of here with your license opinions. It's like,
Possibly I've said that phrase to you.
It's a little different coming from you, put it that way.
I want to jump in on something and tease out a little something. And Amy, particularly I think through I mentioned package managers and Kubernetes and Docker images, like those have some of these same. Steve was talking about radical change in components that might not be well understood, right? So like there was a big thing a little while ago where the Hippocratic license, which is one of the earliest of this wave of ethical open source licenses. There have also been, as Pam was saying, these things comes in waves. There have been previous rounds of these. A project called VCR, actually fairly widely used, adopted the license, I think called it like a minor version change. And so all of a sudden this project that many people had not heard of, but was in their dependency trees, suddenly was, asking their company to not do harm. I believe that revision of the Hippocratic license, language has since changed, but the thought remains the same. It's almost like there's these, I don't want to say backdoor because that implies some bad, but they're like, along with security vulnerabilities, which we're all now aware of in the supply chain, right? That they can pop up a project you've never heard of is suddenly the most important thing in your entire company on 6 p.m. on a Saturday. Like, our governance and licensing some of the same, does it have some of that same kind of potential domino effect of like the CTO could be getting a call at 6 p.m. on a Saturday because some project changed their licensing or their trademark or their governance?
Does. And part of that is sort of, I think we have something around like a minor change being basically like what people would consider to be like a bug fix. And for them, this might just be a bug fix. And for everybody else, it cascades into something more compelling. And I think that the changes that Stephen O'Grady is kind of talking about as far as like these radical changes are things that are happening in kind of one-off areas. But I'm also thinking about like way, way back. Do y'all remember when like codes of conduct were like a really controversial thing? Right? Like, and now because we've spent long enough thinking about thoughtfully why we would have a code of conduct, like where it would live, like who would it apply to, how do we enforce it? It's now become like a regular part of governance. So I see these kind of little license changes that are going on in here as something that has not yet found its home as far as like how do we participate in a world that 20 years ago didn't look like any of this, and what do we want it to look like moving forward? So I think you'll see, yes, okay, these sudden things about like the 6 p.m. on a Saturday, but we will slowly get towards a place where we are kind of coalescing around what that change would look like. I agree that the ethical license pieces are in fact a symptom of this larger sense of we have the power to be able to make our world in software. How do we do it? We haven't yet hit on the right way yet. And I think Pam will probably be able to help us with that, about like walking us through, well, if you want to be able to figure out what your trademark is, where's your governance? If you want to be able to figure out how to be able to change your culture through governance, where do you look? I don't know yet. Sorry, Pam, to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I don't actually have an answer to that question, but I wanted to key off of what you said about the world looking different, and different solutions need to come into play. I think that or the fact that 20 years ago software did not run the world, and software runs the world now. And so now now a software license, we suddenly realize how incredibly powerful a software license can be if used the right way. That software license, there's no business that doesn't have to deal with software licenses. Every kind of industry, we have to deal with it. So I think that's I just was very provoked by that thought that 20 years ago it looked different because software was this very specialized field. Many people live their lives without ever interacting on a regular basis with software. Maybe you'd go to the ATM and that would be your main interaction with some computing program. But now it's so incredibly pervasive and dominant and such a part of our lives. I just wanted to comment on the fact that that has become a really powerful tool, which I think is why people are looking at it in new ways, with new eyes, as how do we use this new tool?
I think a great responsibility as well.
A responsibility as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Actually, that might be a great note for us to wrap on, because I think a thing that one of the threads running through all of this is that we are still in a time very much of change, right? It's a sort of interesting fact, and I think Stephen sort of hinted at this a little bit, that it's pretty unusual that this core infrastructure that we rely on, right, and licenses are, in a very real sense, the part of the core infrastructure of our industry at this point, has not changed in a 20-year span, or has changed very little in a 20-year span, where, as Pam said, we went from being, I always joke that I was one of the top 10 open source license lawyers the day I graduated from law school, because at the time there were only 10 of us, right? And and now, like, you can't fit all of us in a ballroom. And and that's of the ones who are deeply involved, and there's another level beyond that who feel like they need to know, right, who take annual continuing legal education to learn about this stuff. And So it's a little odd that this core infrastructure in some ways hasn't changed, even though the industry as a whole has really radically changed. And I think, one lesson for folks to take away from here is that the governance parts of this are still very much in flux and are not, you know, unlike the licensing where things can be in a lot of ways pretty static. There's still a lot of stuff in flux, and when we get back together for Upstream next year, it'll be, we'll have some different things to talk about, right? And hopefully, unlike what Stephen was saying to kick us off, instead of having the same conversation we had last year, which I completely agree with Stephen's feeling of, oh boy, have had that one before. I think we'll be able to, we'll be seeing almost every day new examples of governance successes, governance failures. Amy brought up there was a governance failure in a high-profile open project just over the weekend, basically, and we're going to have many more examples of that the next time we get together, right? And hopefully we'll learn some things, we'll build some more robust tools, but it's going to take us a while to get there, right? And I think that's hopefully nobody in the audience wanted a one-size-fits-all, nicely boxed and bundled answer from us today, because that's not where we're at. But hopefully it'll be an interesting and fruitful ride for all of us as we both continue to create and consume piles of open source. On that note, thank you again, Amy, Stephen, Pam. As always, it's a great pleasure to talk to you. We could easily turn this into a whole day, and maybe one of these days we will, especially once we can do it again face to face. So